I've started the camera up like 18 times and done an intro. I just don't know. Nothing's really happening. I'm scared. I'm not scared. I'm nervous, but I'm really trying to give you guys videos out here, but this place to the core. But I'm fascinated with it at the same time. I'm hearing noises, dude. And I don't know if it's clicking. I can't hear it. It's like a low. Hello? Oh, it's by my car. Why is my thing going faint? Stop. Okay, I'm gonna get in my car and I'm gonna go. What is that? Okay.
So if this stuff is magnetic, it's another clue of something that was engineered for a specific purpose.
Whoa, 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 whoa.
This stuff is fixing itself.
Yes, it's healing. That's exactly right.
470 feet inside a mesa at Skinwalker Ranch, a drill bit struck something it was never supposed to find. The fragments looked like ordinary broken pottery until a physicist slid one under a microscope, and 3 trained scientists watched it do something no material on Earth should do. Nobody in that lab could explain the mysterious event. And it was only the first sign of the thing buried in the rock below them, the thing nobody has been able to explain since. The fragments from 470 feet.
We made an incredible discovery in the drilling spoils. Pieces of ceramics that appeared to be highly engineered.
For more than 3 years, the team at Skinwalker Ranch had been drilling straight up into a mesa. Not for water, not for oil, not for minerals. They drilled because their own instruments kept insisting there was something massive buried inside that hill. A large object surrounded by a scatter of smaller anomalies, lodged in rock where nothing that size belongs. It was the kind of pursuit that sounds unhinged stated plainly, and the crew knew it. They drilled anyway because every survey came back saying the same impossible thing. The effort was deliberate. The plan called for a second borehole running roughly 600 feet up through the mesa, positioned so that two near-identical holes would sit on either side of the buried object, close enough to lower scanning instruments down both shafts and triangulate whatever waited between them. The large object was the prize, but it was never alone in the data. Around it sat the smaller anomalies, a cluster of returns no one had been able to account for. And it was while chasing those that the bit reached the depth where everything changed. One night, the drill hit something. About 470 feet down, the bit may have clipped one of those objects.
They're drilling through something extremely hard right now.
Copy that.
And we're gonna monitor down here.
When the crew pulled up the drilling spoils, the crushed rock and debris that rides back up the borehole, they began picking through it the way they always did. The work was usually tedious, a matter of sifting gray rubble for anything that broke the pattern. This time, the pattern broke. Among the fragments were pieces of ceramic, not the rough sandy shards left behind by a broken pot or a natural mineral seam. Under the microscope, they looked engineered, clean edges, deliberate structure, the kind of thing manufactured for a purpose. Engineered ceramic, 470 feet inside a mesa. At a depth that should hold nothing but bedrock and silence, the rock had given up the leftovers of something that looked built. The find was strange enough that the team stopped treating it as debris and started treating it as evidence, bagging the pieces and carrying them in for a closer look rather than tossing them back on the pile. The team ran the fragments through a handheld XRF system, an X-ray fluorescence machine that fires X-rays at an object and reads back the elements hiding inside it, a chemical fingerprint scanner. The fingerprint that came back matched nothing ordinary: nickel, iron. Then the readings kept climbing into territory they had no business reaching: cobalt, strontium, thorium. An ordinary ceramic is little more than fired clay, earth-shaped and baked. It is not a checklist of heavy and metallic elements. Yet a fragment drawn from deep inside a Utah mesa read like something pulled from a foundry's periodic table rather than a hillside. Thorium in particular sat oddly on the list, an element more at home in reactor fuel and aerospace alloys than in anything that should have formed naturally in the rock of a remote ranch. Two of those elements carried a particular weight. The cobalt and the nickel pointed towards something specific: magnetic properties. That single possibility was enough to change the air in the room, because if a chunk of buried ceramic could answer to a magnet, the explanation pointing toward nature grew thinner, and the one pointing toward design grew sharper. Someone reached for a box of rare earth magnets, the small, powerful kind, and the crew leaned in to watch. The magnet test. The ceramic responded. It pulled toward the magnet like a piece of iron. Trained men stood around the table trying to make sense of it, because ceramics are not magnetic. That is not a matter of opinion or a fine technical caveat. It is basic material science. Clay does not leap at a magnet. This fragment, dug from a borehole 470 feet down, did exactly that. The effect was not faint or borderline either. It was strong enough that the crew kept testing it, reaching for other pieces to see whether the first had been a fluke, half expecting the strangeness to vanish on the second try. That alone would have kept the lab talking for a week. Then the relationship reversed, the same piece, the same magnet. One moment attracting, the next moment repelling. The field shoved against the material as though two like poles refused to meet. The fragment pushed away by the very magnet that had drawn it in, a breath before. Hands passed the magnet back and forth across the ceramic, feeling the pull give way to a push, and the disbelief in the room only deepened with each repetition, because no amount of repeating it made it behave. No naturally occurring material both attracts and repels a magnet that way. Nature builds nothing that switches sides on command. Iron pulls in, certain materials push away, but a single piece doing both, depending on how it is held, is not a property that turns up in the ground. This fragment did it, and the people holding it had nothing to explain it with. For a team that had spent years cataloging strange readings and dead ends, this was different in kind. The earlier anomalies had been signals on a screen, things measured at a distance and argued over. This was a solid object in a man's hand, doing something the textbook said no object could, and there was no instrument to blame and no glitch to chase down. The elemental makeup carried an unsettling resemblance of its own. It looked, in part, like the signature of a superconductor, one of the strangest classes of material known to science and still only partly understood. A superconductor carries energy with no resistance and interacts with magnets in ways that resemble sleight of hand, hovering, repelling, locking in place, the same uncanny behavior on display at the table. Materials like that are not curiosities. They are the basis of magnetic levitation transport, and, in the more ambitious corners of research, the kind of advanced engineering that turns up in serious proposals for future propulsion. The resemblance left a single enormous question hanging over the ranch. If a fragment pulled from the mesa behaves like a superconductor, then what is buried inside it, and who would have had the means to put it there? The questions only multiply from here, and the channel follows them past the point where most accounts stop. Subscribing keeps this investigation in view as the next layer is uncovered. The magnet test had been strange. What happened under the microscope belonged to another category entirely. The event, no scientist could name. The ranch owner arranged a meeting at Utah Valley University with a physicist, Dr. Brian Patchett, a man who had spent a career working with highly engineered ceramic materials for the space industry. Heat-resistant, energy-conducting, the serious end of the field. If anyone alive could glance at these fragments and dismiss them as nothing, it was him. The samples were mounted and slid into a scanning electron microscope, an instrument that resolves the surface of a material in detail no handheld lens on a ranch could reach. The chamber was sealed. The air was drawn out into vacuum until the sample sat in a pocket of nothing, isolated from the room, untouched by anything but the beam about to sweep across it. The image sharpened, and the room narrowed to the glow of a single screen. Almost at once, something looked wrong. There were clearly defined holes across the surface, dark and circular against the pale ceramic, small at first. Then a question moved around the table, the kind no one wanted to be the one to ask. Were the holes getting bigger? They were. The surface of a solid ceramic fragment was opening up in real time, pores spreading and widening while the men watched, a piece of supposedly inert material behaving as though it were alive, the edges of each hole creeping outward frame by frame. The talk in the room rose, then fell away into the particular silence that settles when people stop performing for one another and start being genuinely unnerved. Composure drained out of the physicist's voice. He leaned closer to the screen, and so did the others, until the only motion in the lab was the slow bloom of holes that should not have been moving at all. A reasonable theory surfaced. The electron beam itself might be damaging the sample, eating into the surface, carving the holes. There is nothing strange about a powerful beam degrading a material under vacuum. So, they ran the obvious test and switched the beam off, expecting the damage to hold where it was, or at worst, to stop. The holes did not stop spreading. They closed. The pores shrank back. The surface that had torn itself open began to knit itself shut, the fragment undoing its own damage while four men who had spent their lives studying materials watched and recorded it, comparing the live image against the screen grab from minutes before and finding less ruin in the rock each time they looked. The fragment was repairing itself, healing. A material that closes its own gaps must move something, fill something, rebuild what was torn open. Modern laboratories manage faint, deliberate versions of self-repair in a handful of experimental polymers, and even those are fragile, slow, and barely past the research stage. Not in pottery, not in rock, not in a fragment pulled from drilling spoils with no known maker, and no record of how long it had lain in the dark. The physicist's entire career had been built on knowing what advanced ceramics can and cannot do, and this one had walked straight past the edge of that knowledge. Neither he nor the two other scientists in the lab had seen a ceramic behave this way. If the fragment could do this, the obvious next question was what it was actually made of, and the answer would point somewhere no one in that lab expected: the stealth connection. A deeper elemental analysis followed, the lab bombarding the surface with X-rays and reading the energy of the electrons that came back to pin down exactly what was present. The more sophisticated equipment confirmed the ranch readings and added detail. Carbon and oxygen turned out to be the two most prevalent elements, followed by silicon, then magnesium and aluminum running close together, then calcium, then iron. The carbon was the surprise. No one had expected that much of it. Carbon is one of the main ingredients in radar-absorbing stealth material, the kind engineered to hide aircraft from detection. One member of the team had built a crude version of it himself, mixing charcoal for the carbon, an aluminum binding agent, and ordinary spray glue, and using it to make a vehicle harder to see on radar. Rough work, but the same basic chemistry that militaries have spent decades refining to slip their craft past radar, and, in some experimental cases, out of plain sight. The question reframed itself around a darker possibility. The buried ceramic might be a cloaking material, and a cloaking material implies a thing meant to be hidden. The decision came fast, and it came firm. The original plan had been to drill at almost any cost, to punch through to the anomaly and study it directly. But a drill is a blunt instrument, and the thing in the rock might be both fragile and important. The order was to stop, before the bit destroyed the very thing the investigation existed to understand. Whatever lay in that mesa now demanded the patient hands of an archaeological approach, not brute force. After years of work under their stewardship, the team treated the moment as a turning point. The next clue, though, did not come out of the rock at all. It came from the historical record. The 1964 nickel and the missing years. A few days earlier, sifting through those same drilling spoils, the team archaeologist had pulled out something small, ordinary, and badly out of place. An encrusted coin, a 1964 nickel. A single buried coin means little on its own. But the archaeologist offered a detail that turned it into a thread worth pulling. Archaeologists will sometimes bury a coin at a site to mark the year their work was done, a timestamp left in the ground. By that logic, the nickel raised the possibility that someone had already dug into this exact mesa back in 1964, decades before the current crew arrived, as though someone had known there was something here worth finding. So the team went looking through official records from the state of Utah, hunting for aerial photographs of the mesa taken during geological surveys across the past 60 years. A previous dig might have left a scar an old photo would show. What the records held instead was a hole. There were images from 1961, from 1963. Then nothing. A blank stretch with no available photographs all the way until 1969. The exact window that swallowed 1964, the same year stamped on the nickel. 6 years of aerial imagery simply gone. A clerical accident was possible. So was something deliberate. The photographs that did survive, from 1961, 1963, and 1969, looked nearly identical to the naked eye. The same mesa, the same terrain. To be certain nothing had been tampered with, the team ran the images through an AI program built to flag artificial changes, the kind of digital smoothing a human eye would never catch. The older photos came back clean. The 1969 image did not. The software flagged a specific spot, a patch that appeared dithered or smoothed, brushed over with a filter absent from the earlier shots. A faint raised shape almost like a leaf, brighter and blurrier than the ground around it. By the analysis, that meant the picture had been altered. 3 facts now sat end to end. A missing window of years, a coin stamped from inside that window, and an edited photograph from the moment the record resumes, with the editing centered on the one stretch of ground that mattered. Any one of them alone is forgettable. Together they read like the fingerprints of someone working to erase a chapter, because no one bothers to alter a photograph of empty ground. What had been a scientific puzzle was turning into something colder, and the instrument that turned it cold was already on its way up the mesa. What the radar found. With the drilling stopped, the team brought in a different kind of tool, and a ground-penetrating radar expert arrived with a specialized device built to be lowered straight down the existing borehole, scanning sideways into the rock as it descended. The principle is close to sonar, but aimed through solid stone, reaching out in a radius around the hole to map whatever waited in the dark. The radar went into the pipe, and the slow, steady descent began, the device sinking foot by foot into a column of rock that had not been seen by any instrument from top to bottom before. At the bottom of the hill, 2 crew members stood ready to keep the line from snagging, and the rest gathered around the readout as the depth counter climbed. The first stretch was quiet. Down 30 meters, then 40, then 50. About 165 feet into the rock, nothing worth a second look, only the flat, uneventful grain of stone, the kind of empty reading that makes a search feel like it might dissolve into nothing. The descent continued, the tray scrolling clean across the screen. And then the scan reached roughly 270 feet, and the screen changed. Something was there, something so distinct that the whole room reacted in the same instant. The easy expert calm gone out of the air at once. The mass sat out away from the borehole, around 12 feet to the side, and the radar measured it at roughly 6 feet thick. A solid, defined shape buried in the rock, bright and unmistakable against the dead gray of stone, with smaller bits and pieces trailing further down. It did not stand alone. It lined up with the very depth where the other instruments had already registered anomalous data, two completely different methods pointing at the same buried spot. That overlap was the hinge of everything. The mass near this borehole might be continuous with what the drill had clipped near the other, which meant the readings were no longer a scatter of unrelated curiosities. They were the outline of a single, central, massive object running through the heart of the mesa, possibly metal, at least 6 feet thick. The same depth where a camera lowered into the second borehole days earlier had registered gamma rays, and possibly the same thing the engineered, self-healing ceramic had been wrapped around. Asked directly whether the data might be showing something not natural, something potentially technological inside the rock, the radar expert gave an answer with no softening in it. Yes, the thing in the mesa appeared to be exactly that, and the cover-up thread snapped tight around that reading. A 6-foot mass, possibly metallic, possibly built, sealed inside the mesa, sitting at the same ground that an aerial photograph had been altered to smooth over. The implication was no longer abstract. Someone, at some point, appeared to have worked to erase the record of the very thing the radar had just found, which meant the strangeness in the rock might not be the oldest part of the story. The oldest part might be the people who already knew it was down there, and went to the trouble of making sure no one else would. The full extent of what is buried in that mesa has not yet been reached. Subscribing ensures the next stage of this investigation does not go unseen. The drill sits idle now. The boreholes run cold and empty into the hillside, two narrow throats of dark leading down to a thing no one has touched. 12 feet off to the side, 6 feet of something solid waits in the rock exactly where it has waited far longer than anyone can prove. Unexcavated and unnamed, sheathed in a ceramic that healed its own wounds in front of men who could not say how. Above it, in a photograph that someone smoothed over and no one can account for, a small altered patch of ground keeps whatever it was meant to keep, and around all of it, the mesa holds its silence.